I want to get to some breaking news now just in, and it is a letter from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to House Democrats. Hans Nichols is with us. Hans, before we get to you, I want to explain to folks what this letter is, and it is just in. The Secretary of State, we saw him at the top of the show overseas tweeting this, and this is specifically addressed to the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Remember that tomorrow and Thursday are the first of 5 depositions that have been scheduled with either current or former State Department officials who may be able to provide Congress with more information about what was in that whistleblower complaint. Listen to this. Here's what the Secretary of State says, that he is concerned with aspects of this request that can be understood, quote, only as an attempt to intimidate, bully, and treat improperly the distinguished professionals of the Department of State, alleging that the committee is now targeting those individuals. Hans, this letter can only be read, it seems to me, one way, and that is that Mike Pompeo sure isn't happy with members of Congress right now.
And he's strongly signaling, Howie, that the State Department will not cooperate with those congressional subpoenas and as well as deposition requests that they made on September the 27th. He's directly addressing Mr. Engel. He's the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee on the House side, and he's saying he's concerned about the overall threatening and intimidating approach that he feels that the committee has taken. Now, here's what he's not doing in this letter. He's not vowing not to cooperate. He's not saying that these 5 individuals.
But he is saying that these dates for depositions are not feasible, that these people are not being deposed on the dates the committee wants.
They will not be available then. I don't read this as a blanket, I will not cooperate. I read this as a strong signal that they're going to slow walk this. And we have to find out if they're ultimately available and amenable to other dates. But it's a strong indication, regardless on whether or not he's fully putting it down, that they are very unlikely to cooperate with one of the committees that's part of this overall impeachment investigation, this impeachment inquiry. Remember, there are 3 committees that are all coming at this, different lines of efforts. Mike Pompeo abroad using Twitter to let the House Democrats know that he is unlikely to cooperate. So we're going to have to find out just more on what their overall strategy is. Hallie?
Yeah, part of what they seem to be upset about, Hans, as I'm looking through this letter with you here, is the vast amount of documents, to quote from Mike Pompeo here, that was requested from these various officials. And just to remind people, these people are State Department employees. In one instance, Kurt Volker, the former special representative for Ukraine negotiations, who stepped down, according to 2 sources talking to us, only last week, last Friday. One source saying, hey, that'll let him be more free in what he can and cannot say to Congress, Hans. But this letter lays out sort of the legal reasons, it seems, or at least the political reasons why the Secretary of State is saying these depositions aren't happening when you want.
And there seems to be a little bit more in here, Holly, as well, that he's concerned with some of the communications that the State Department or that Congress is trying to have with the State Department through other channels. They say that committee staff have contacted members in the administration, State Department officials looking for more information. It seems to me like he's clamping down and is very unlikely to cooperate. And remember, Pompeo now is at the center of this as well, because we know that Mike Pompeo was on that July 25th phone call, the one that we have the call logs from, where the President of the United States has that conversation with the Ukrainian president. That is at the center of all this. The depositions that the House Democrats want to get, they want to try to fill in some of the gray areas on what that call was about, maybe was on the back end of it as well, and crucially, what happened with that call log and whether or not it was treated in any other way, because that's at the core of what the whistleblower is alleging, is that this was somehow put in a separate position, in a separate secure location, and that officials themselves in the White House were concerned about the call. Hallie?
Thank you for checking out our YouTube channel. Why don't you subscribe? It's really easy. Just click on that button down there. And for more news from MSNBC, click on any of these videos here for the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more videos from MSNBC with our newsletters. Head over to msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up.